Okay, we're looking at, and I'm asking you, do you understand Satan's war against God? That's kind of the theme of the scriptures. From the beginning, Satan has snuck in and ruined the human race, he thinks. And it's all part of God's plan to come himself and rescue them and redeem them. So, where we are in the scriptures, we're right here in this third section of the book of Revelation. It's kind of right in the center of the tribulation where God's explaining stuff. And what he explains is that once he has redeemed his church and taken them out of the world, he returns to work with his chosen people of promise. That's who the Jews are. That's who they've always been. God says, if you read in Deuteronomy, he said, I didn't pick you because you were the mightiest or the smartest or the richest or the greatest. I picked you because simply I loved you. So God picked Israel out of all the nations on the earth, and he put them on what we call the hinge of the continents. Israel is right in the land bridge connection between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And he put them there so that when all of the caravans and trade routes went north and south and east and west, they would come through and hear about this God that was the creator. Well, to remember where we are, yesterday we ended with this fascination humanity has with demonism, and we saw what happens when God lets them out, briefly. He lets the demons out to terrorize, not to immediately kill, but to terrorize the people on earth. And then we're in the middle of this section. Lost humanity seeks to rule themselves. In fact, it's the American dream. The American dream is to be self-sufficient. God says, you can't be self-sufficient. Only I am self-sufficient. But the American dream is to make as much money as you can so no one tells you what to do. And God's desire is the very center request of the 7 in the Lord's Prayer, and that is, give me or give us this day our daily bread. God wants to keep us needing him every day. America wants us to not need him anymore. We're going to make Bloomberg's used to say you needed $1 million to retire. Now Bloomberg says $3 million is what you need, but if you want to be comfortable, you need $5 million. I mean, and you know what it says? 95% of all Americans will never have $5 million, so they really never retire. You bump into them at Walmart, right? They're old and they're handing you a basket. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful. But why is our world all wanting to be self-sufficient? Because we were born with this sinful heart that wants to rule ourselves. We are rebels at heart. No one had to teach me to be selfish. I mean, as soon as I got old enough to stand up and see the table, I wanted the biggest cookie. I wanted the cake, no matter whose birthday it was. Do you understand what I mean? And I cried when everybody else got presents. And so you know what parents do. They give you a present too, so you don't ruin the other birthday parties. But we want to rule ourselves and be kind of our little God. But humanity rejects God's Messiah. God actually walked on earth, God the Son. And he did what no one else ever did. He fed thousands at a time. He could heal blinded eyes. He could give back sight to people, hearing to people. He gave back to the lepers their lost appendages. You know what I mean. He raised people from the dead. He walked on the water. We know everything he did. He liberated them from demons. And what did humanity do with God's Messiah? Rejected him. But look at this. So God sends a fake Jesus. Satan has been trying to be the Messiah and has always had his fake Jesus in the wings. Now, in Paul's day and John's day, it was Nero. Nero was the beginning of these Roman emperors that were against Christianity and wanted to be worshipped. And then Domitian was a big one, and they keep going through. And then after that, in ancient times, Genghis Khan was one. He tried to conquer the whole world. You remember the Mongol hordes came all the way to Vienna in Europe. And then, I mean, in more modern times, we've had all of the modern conquerors that have come through. Adolf Hitler is one. He was really Satan's choice. He hated the Jewish people. He had a form of Christianity, Lutheranism, that he converted into him being the one they worshiped, and they all, raised their hand to. So God sends the fake Jesus. He's called the beast, which we most of all know as the Antichrist. By the way, this person has 33 titles in the Bible. The man of sin, the one with the fierce face. I mean, you read about all this in the Old Testament as the prophets are describing this final world ruler. He's what I call the worst human who ever lives. He's human, but he's totally indwelt by the devil. I mean, Satan usually only has parts of people, but boy, this guy, he has them all. And he, the Antichrist, with Satan's power, leads humanity to destruction by becoming their God, okay? But what we're talking about is the bigger picture. Revelation 11 through 13 is about the war in heaven. It's the only place we see this play out, that there's actually war in heaven, and God has to cast Satan out, who no longer is going to be allowed to come and accuse us before the throne of God. And he is confined to the earth. Boy, does it become. I mean, Satan is kind of flitting all over. He's up, accusing. He's only can be in one place at a time. He is localized, like all of us are and all demons are. Only God is, and even Jesus was localized in his incarnation. But God is everywhere present. Satan is not. So in the war, God confines him to earth. And we'll see that. We're going to actually go through that. But really, the bottom line of this is that World War III, that's kind of a term for the final war. World War III is all about Iran, because that's the one nation that God most has pointed out has as its desire the destruction of the chosen people of promise, Israel. So Iran, Jerusalem, and Satan's endless hatred of the Jewish people. So that's what we're going to study. Part 1, go to chapter 11. Look at this. And I was given a reed. Back to John. This is a continuous narration of, he's writing down what he saw, what he did, what he heard, what God told him, what the angels told him. And he's trying to describe, in first century terms, end of the world events. And he's having trouble. You know how often he says, it was like a cloud, it was like a flash, it was like, it's like a person that's looking at something that they can hardly describe. But here, he says, then I was given a reed like a measuring rod. And the angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave the court that's outside the temple and don't measure it, because it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Now here's the mathematics of the tribulation. Daniel chapter 9 tells us the tribulation is a week of years, a heptad. That's a Hebrew word for a 7. We have dozens, and you know what dozen means as soon as I say it. It means 12, okay? To a Jewish-minded person, they thought in sevens. They're heptadic. That means that to them, the 7 is the kind of the perfect divine measurement. And so the tribulation is a week, 7 years, one heptad. But God talks about it in so many different ways. It's 42 months and 42 months. It's 1,260 days and 1,260 days. It's 3.5 years and 3.5 years. And so we're running into one of those right now. And what it says is in Revelation 11:1 that John is seeing in the future a temple that's involved in chapter 11 in this 42-month period. It's the same temple that the 2 witnesses are walking around. It's the same temple that the Antichrist in Daniel 9 is going to set up an image to be worshipped called the abomination that causes desolation. And it's the same temple that John is right now given this measuring stick. So he's measuring it. Now, what we call it is the third temple. Here's the first temple, the one Solomon built. That's just an artistic representation by archaeologists and historians. This is Herod's temple. Let's see. Brandon, you saw this, aren't you the one that went to Israel, or did more of you go to Israel? How many of you went to Israel with Mark Strout? How many of you went to Israel Museum and you saw that giant, this big model? That's the temple right there. You guys recognize it. That's the Holy Land Hotel where it used to be. Now Israel Museum, 1 to 60? I don't know. It's every inch 50 or 60 inches. So an inch in this model is 5 feet long. And here is the Holy of Holies and the holy place. The southern steps are down here. Here's the Antonian fortress. But that's Herod's temple that was destroyed by the Romans. But John is measuring it. That means that there's a third temple because it's not there now. There's something else there now, right? The Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The first temple was during Solomon's time, who basically got it built in these 20 years from 970 to 950. The second temple is Herod's from 20 BC until 26 AD, until the life and ministry of Christ. They were still building it. Remember, they said 40 and 6 years. Remember that in the Gospels? When Jesus said, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up. They went, what? For 40 and 6 years. See that from 20 BC to 26 AD. For 40 and 6 years, we've still been building this, and you're going to raise up in 3 days? And the Bible says, but he was talking about the temple of his body. But here's the third temple. We know that one was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. The third temple is right here in Revelation 11. The final temple, there's another one coming, and that's in Revelation 20, and that's going to be amazing for us to spend time studying. But there's a future Jewish temple during the tribulation in Jerusalem that Daniel saw, clear as day. One of the greatest prophecies in all the Bible is Daniel 9. And that's where Daniel connects all this together. And what he says is, the coming people that crucify the Messiah, the people that crucify him, are going to be the same people that are the empire that ends the world. And it's like, whoa. Who crucified Christ? Well, the Jews delivered him up but didn't have the civil authority to perform execution. So they gave him to Pilate, the Roman governor. So the people, the nation, I know the Jews were guilty. And Jesus said, that they are the ones that delivered him up. But the Romans pounded the nails. So the people that actually did the crucifixion are the Romans. And the Romans are the ones that are coming back. And the Antichrist that we're going to meet this hour in the scriptures is a future Roman ruler. Now, that has a lot of meanings because the Roman Empire, if you looked at it, I told you yesterday, half of it is what we call Europe. The other half was what we call Northern Africa, and kind of the connector is what we call the Middle East. The Middle East is totally Muslim, other than that little speck of Israel and a few Christian Arabs. Northern Africa is totally Muslim, other than a few Christian Arabs and Jews that live among them here and there. And Europe is now fast becoming, in the next decade, in your life, Europe will become a majority Muslim. So everything that was the Roman Empire is Muslim in our current time. Jesus saw it in Matthew 24, that same temple. He said, you're going to see a future day when the abomination that causes desolation, as Daniel describes, so Jesus affirms Daniel's prophecy, and he said that this Antichrist is going to come and put an image of himself in the temple. And we're going to study that today. It's amazing. The image, how do you like this, is a machine that can talk and kill. That's interesting. Now, for you, it's not hard to imagine that because that's kind of science fiction. I mean, well, I shouldn't even go off on that. When Bonnie and I were newlyweds, we lived in Los Angeles. We used to eat at that restaurant I told you about where the guy was a cocaine addict. And sometimes we ate at the public table. There was one table that seated 15 people that you could eat breakfast at, and all the rest were little tables. And sometimes when everything else was taken, we'd sit at that table. And one time we sat down, and this other guy came and sat down right across from us. His shoulders were literally this wide. His legs were literally this wide. He was wearing shorts, and when he sat down, I'd never seen that many muscles in my life. And he ate his breakfast real fast and talked. He had a little German accent, if you know what I'm talking about. He was currently Mr. universe, one of the greatest weightlifters of all times, and he was filming a film series in Los Angeles and ate at our restaurant. And when he got done eating, he walked, he said, "So long," however he talks, and he went out, and I stood up and watched him, and he got into a Corvette, and he put his left hand on the driver's side door, and he lifted himself up with one arm, his whole body, and sat behind the wheel. He didn't open the door. He was that muscular. I said, "Honey, that's Arnold Schwarzenegger." You know what his movies he was filming were? About the abomination that causes desolation, only he called it the Terminator, which was a cyborg that killed. That's what Revelation 13 we're going to see describes, the image of the Antichrist he puts in this temple. Anybody that won't worship him, that machine goes through the world and kills them. It's how most of the converts are going to be killed, according to the Bible. Paul sees the same thing in 2 Thessalonians 2, this temple in Jerusalem during the tribulation, and of course John is measuring it right here. Okay, what is the lesson? Look at verse 2. "But leave the temple and the outside the temple, do not measure it, for it's been given to the Gentiles. They will tread it underfoot for 42 months, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses," verse 3, "and they will prophesy 1,000, here comes that other number, 3.5 years, 42 months equals 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees, the lampstand standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, we all know this, fire proceeds from their mouth, devours their enemies," kind of like with Elijah. Do you remember when the army was coming to Elijah and Elisha? And do you remember when Elijah was up there and they were trying to get him, and they came to get him, and he said, "No, you can't have me. I'm not going to come." And finally, the Lord kept burning up all the soldiers. It's the same thing, this protection kind of flamethrower, and it devours their enemies. "And if anyone wants to kill them, they were killed in this manner. And they will have power," now look at verse 6, "like Moses had like Elijah had, to shut heavens so that no rain falls in their days. And they will have power over water to turn them to blood like Moses, and to strike the earth with plagues like Moses as often as they desire." And that's why most people think that the 2 witnesses are Moses and Elijah, because they're doing the fire burning thing like Elijah did, and they're doing the blood and water and plagues like Moses did. "And they'll finish their testimony, and the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit," verse 7, "will make war against them." So God limits the career of the Antichrist. Basically, what we see is Antichrist only rules the world for 42 months. And these 2 guys are here in this temple as his nemesis. He can't kill him. He can't destroy him. If any of his soldiers get close enough, they get burned up, and God has this witness. So, that's the second point. Third point is God deploys these 2 witnesses at this temple to remind people of the truth. Satan comes and indwells the Antichrist and said, "This is the Jewish Messiah." So the Antichrist seems to have some connection with the Jews, and there are a lot of speculations about that. But what happens in verse 4 is what I call a messianic revival. "These are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands standing before the God of all the earth." They are pointing to God, and they are going to be watched by the world. And these 2 prophets are going to keep telling the world about the true Messiah so that they can see the contrast. See, God always wants to have a witness. Now, let's just describe the 2 witnesses. The outer court, 42 months. The witnesses are empowered 1,260 days. It's the same time period. They called on fire from heaven and shut the heaven like Elijah did. They turn water into blood and smite the earth like Moses did. But then it says, the beast from the same place. That's the abyss. The Greek word is abuso. That's the same place we saw yesterday, where Abaddon is, and where it's the prison house for the worst. Now, it's not the chain place. That is a different place. It's called Tartarus. Those never get out, and that is a separate place, and I'll show it to you a little later. I'll show you a drawing of it. But earth dwellers celebrate, and they're resurrected after 3.5 days. So that's basically everything we know about the two witnesses. We don't know who they are, but there's a lot of speculation that they're Elijah, because he never died, he was taken to heaven. Enoch also was taken to heaven and never died. So the Bible says that is appointed unto man once to die. So some people say it has to be Enoch and Elijah. But because of the similarities of their miraculous powers, God gives them, Elijah and Moses are really the biggest candidates of all. Okay, keep going to verse 5. They serve God for half the tribulation, most likely the second half. Verse 7 tells us when they finish their testimony, the Antichrist makes war and overcomes and kills them. So humanity gets their Messiah. They don't want the real Messiah. They don't want the one that the two witnesses who serve God for half the tribulation say. What they're saying is that the Antichrist is not real. The Antichrist is not the right one. He is Satan's man. And what God does is he gives the world 42 months to decide. But what I love is verse 8. And their dead bodies of chapter 11 of Revelation, verse 8, will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. What's the great city? Jerusalem. So the two witnesses are killed by the beast, and their bodies, they kill them and they leave them. And then look at this. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies for 3.5 days, and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth. You understand, there is no way to say everybody on earth more distinctly than what we saw in those two verses. Look what it says in verse 9. The peoples, the tribes, the tongues, and the nations. That's everybody on earth. How else can you describe people, tribes, tongues, nations? It's kind of like a comprehensive statement. But then, verse 10, those who dwell on the earth will rejoice. So basically what this is saying is for 3.5 days in the future, which we call the end times, they will have global television and communications because the whole world is watching. Remember I told you last week that one of the first globally watched events was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, 50, 60 years ago? It was one of the first things that televisions on 6 of the continents through satellites were watching. Amazing. But you know what? This is going to be unbelievable that people from everyone on earth, and probably it's not going to be on television, it's probably going to be live streamed by people. And people are going to be coming. This is just a major thing. These fire-breathing, horrible, negative, mean, sackcloth-wearing weirdos to the world, we know them as God's two witnesses, finally aren't stopping it from raining. I mean, among all the other problems they're having in the tribulation, these people are causing further, exacerbating problems, and so people are live streaming it. And look what happens while the whole world is watching and they're live streaming. It says, now after verse 11, now after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Wow. The whole world is watching, but what happens is, what we're going to see in verse 13, in the same hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city, that's Jerusalem, fell. In the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and 7,000? I mean, in Jerusalem, that whole province of Antioch, area around Antioch, we had 50 or 60,000 recently killed, but it wasn't just in Antioch, but just in Jerusalem, 7,000. It's going to be a very huge earthquake. But look what it says. The rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. Some people, some hard-hearted, fence-sitting, not loving God people get shaken enough. Look what they do in verse 13. They glorify the God of heaven. Now notice what it says. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. There are these woes. The first one, if you remember, was in chapter 8, from verses 13 to 9:12. We read that. It was, yesterday. This, right here is the second woe. The third woe is coming. And it truly is orchestrated following God's plan. Okay, now look at verse 19. So the seventh angel sounds in verse 15, and the 24 elders in verse 16 fall on their faces and worship God. And verse 17 and 18 has the content of that worship. And verse 19, the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of the covenant. Oh, it's not in that warehouse where Indiana Jones left it. It's in heaven. See, God's never lost the ark. The real ark is in heaven. See, it says, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. And as soon as I say that, what is this? What is this talking about? Well, it's the same thing that Hebrews talks about. And the more you understand that the whole Bible is interconnected and explains itself, when Hebrews tells us in chapter 9 that when Moses in Exodus goes up on the mountain to meet with God, not only did he get the 10 Commandments, he also came down with plans for how to build the tabernacle. How do you think they built that thing? Moses was shown, the book of Hebrews says, the temple in heaven and all of those things that we know as the tabernacle furniture. Hebrews 9 says Moses was shown them when he was up on the mountain. And so there is in heaven a temple, and it has those altars in it, and it has this ark in it, and that's what Moses saw, described, and brought down, and they replicated and built and had in the tabernacle, and then moved him into the temple. But look at this. This whole last point in chapter 11 is about worship. Notice it says, and the seventh angel sounded in verse 15, and it says, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign for. You ever heard that little tune? That's the Messiah chorus. That's where Handel was studying the Bible and wrote the Messiah, that amazing English worship chorus that was performed for Queen Victoria. And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones, verse 16, fell on their faces and worshiped God. The content, they said, we give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was, who is to come, because you've taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry and your wrath has come. You know what this means? The people in heaven during the tribulation are tracking with what God's doing on earth. You understand that? God is letting us see him conquer back the world. And we are rejoicing with him. And it continues in verse 18, that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. Now there, you know the climate that's being ruined? I mean, even today, the recycling plant in Indiana is burning, and they're evacuating thousands and thousands of people. It's just that huge cloud of black smoke drifting across, poisoning people in the air, is a reminder that humans are destroying the earth. And you know what God says? I'm quite aware of that, and I'm going to destroy those who destroy the earth. And the temple was opened, and I already read that, and there was lightning and noises and thunderings and earthquakes and great hail. Okay, real quick lesson. To end chapter 11, God expects worship. We already saw it in chapter 4. We already saw it in chapter 5. Now we pause at the end of chapter 11. God expects worship. And in fact, the angel says when we get to chapter 19, when John is so overcome by what he sees with Jesus getting ready to return, the angel that showed him, John gets down ready to worship him, and the angel says, don't do that. Don't worship me, worship God. See, God expects worship. Why does he want us to worship him? As we worship God, he quickens our conscience by his holiness. You notice, if you read the words of what I just read to you, if you slowly read chapter 11, 18, and 17, those verses about, starting in 16, about God, God quickens. That means he brings to life and makes our conscience aware of his holiness. And as we worship, God nourishes our minds. How? By truth. Jesus said that in his great high priestly prayer in John 17. Sanctify them by thy truth. Thy word is truth. When we worship God, we are to be using his word. That's why all true worship involves the repetition of truths about God from his word. That's why a good worshiper should always be analyzing what they're singing or hearing or saying, because they want it to be congruent. They want it to be orthodox. They want it to connect with the scriptures, kind of like the Bereans, Paul's teaching. Because worship is God nourishing our minds by truth. So we have to be very careful that our songs, the lyrics, are truth. God's truth. Because worship is to nourish our minds. As we worship, God purifies our imaginations by his beauty. We start seeing one of the attributes of God. Do you remember there are 25 in systematic theology? There are 25 attributes of God. Do you know what one of them is? He's beautiful. He's the sum of all that's beautiful. And we sing about that. Oh Lord, you're beautiful, and your face is all I seek. And worship causes us to be purified, because we want our minds not to be filled with the warped twistedness of the God of this world. A lot of people nowadays, all they think about are the images they see in music videos and games and in action movies, and their minds are just filled with that. How do we combat that? Worship purifies our imaginations so that our imaginations are not impure, but they're purified by the beauty of God. And as we worship, God opens our hearts to his love. We just well up in love. And so as we worship, we submit our wills to his purpose. See, worship is really submission. But it starts by us being quickened by his holiness, nourished by his truth, purified by his beauty. Our hearts are open to his love, and we submit to his purpose. Now we get to chapter 12. Boy, chapter 12 is really interesting. Chapter 12 reveals to us that there is a galaxy-wide, it's actually universe-wide, but I didn't have a picture of the whole universe, cosmic being, demonic warfare raging today. Now, chapter 9, it just tells us about some of the combatants, but what's here? Well, look at chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, a great sign appeared in heaven. Now, what you'll see here is interesting. There are 7 signs that, and this is the launching of these signs, okay? Semeion is the Greek word. And it was a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and her head had a garland of 12 stars, kind of like a little diadem there. And she was expecting, and she was with child, and she cried out in labor, and in pain she gave birth. Another sign, here's the second of the 7, appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. Whoa, now we get to a very important verse, verse 4. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. That's where we see in the rebellion, in the fight, in Satan's plan, God allows him to take 1/3 of the stars of heaven. They're called the heavenly host. What are they? Well, actually, Jesus said in chapter 1, the 7 stars which you see in my hand are the 7 messengers, the 7 angeloi. And so it's very interesting that Revelation has already tied the concept of stars as a representation of messengers of God. He holds them and sends them. And so these stars in this sign, now remember, this is all, what would we say, figurative. I mean, there isn't really a woman. The woman we're going to see is Israel, but it's appearing as a woman. So what we're seeing is what most people say are the hard parts of Revelation. There are these images, these representations, these illustrations God uses. So he takes 1/3 of the stars, verse 4, 1/3 of the angels, threw them to earth. So that's Satan's rebellion. And the dragon, who's the dragon? It's Satan, stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. What is this? Is this a dragon eating a child? What is this? It's Satan trying to destroy Christ, the child of the woman. The woman is Israel. Israel's the one that God chose to bear the Messiah. So it's just a fascinating description of what we don't think about. We think about, our economy and am I going to have enough money and get a job and pay back my student loans, and will I ever get married, and where will we live? Interest rates are too high, and what about, all the diseases that are around? We think down here. This is the stratospheric view, the cosmic view. She bore a male child, verse 5, who will rule all nations with a rod of iron. Do you remember there are 800 allusions in the book of Revelation to other verses in the Bible? What's that an allusion to? Psalm 2. It says that Jesus is going to rule the nations with a rod of iron. And that's a Psalm 2 reference. So this is just one of the 800. And the child was caught up to God in his throne. When did that happen? That's the ascension of Christ from the Mount of Olives, when Jesus ascends after his death, burial, and resurrection, and stays around 40 days, teaching his disciples. And then 10 days before Pentecost, this event happens. And then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God that he should feed her there for 1,260 days. What is that? It's a future event where God rescues Israel. So, 7 signs. In verse 3, this horrible dragon is Satan. You say, well, how do you know that it's Satan? Well, look over into verse 9. So the great dragon was cast out. Who is the great dragon? Verse 9, one of the most important verses connecting everything. The serpent of old, that's Genesis 3, the one that tempted Eve, called the devil, that's Matthew 4, the one that takes Jesus out in the wilderness and tempts him, and Satan, which is a Hebrew word. Satan means adversary. We know Satan, he's the bad guy, who deceives the whole world, was cast to earth, and his angels were cast out with him. That's how we know that dragon with his tail taking a third of the stars. Some of you were thinking, I don't see angels in there. That's because you have to read the rest. Verse 9 identifies the dragon as Satan and the stars he gets as his angels. So here's what, in Sunday school books, they used to illustrate everything in Sunday school books, so I clipped this out. How would you like a Sunday school lesson in your church where you're doing chapter 12, and here's the dragon with all the stars. See a third of the stars here, and he's got, all these heads and everything. And here's the woman. She has stars, and she is expecting, and she has her feet on the moon, and the sun is behind her. And you'd go, boy, is that really different. You know what I mean? What is it talking about? Well, it's talking about this. From the beginning, remember, Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28 tell us Satan has wanted to destroy, disrupt, resist, and do everything he can in opposition to God's plan. That's what's going on constantly around us. Nobody is smarter or more powerful among God's creations than Satan. So he is constantly coaching his third of the angels to do everything he can to disrupt. And what is God's plan right now? That you all be his invasion force to go out into the world and to be little representations of Christ, Christians, as Acts 11 calls us, and to reflect Christ and to talk about him and to act like him and have people think that we are just little Christ. Now, what has Satan done along the way? He tried to corrupt Adam's line by sending in those angels that are now incarcerated and caused God to kill everybody on earth except for 8 people. That was all Satan's doing. He tried to corrupt Abraham's seed by sending him down to Egypt and having him marry Hagar instead of having the woman that God gave him through whom the seed of promise should come, Sarah. He got him off on Hagar. Then the famine, which tried to drive Israel out of the promised land into Egypt, and then when they were there, Pharaoh tried to kill all the males. That's to destroy. That was Satan using Pharaoh to try and kill all the male Jewish progeny so that there would be no Messiah to come. And then Pharaoh tries to kill all of them, running them out into the sea. And then, if you remember, there came this moment when there was only one descendant of David left, and Athaliah tried to kill him. Then in the New Testament, Satan tried to make Joseph afraid so he wouldn't marry Mary. And then Herod, after Jesus was born, tried to kill all the babies. Then Jesus goes to his hometown in Luke 4, and the people tried to throw him off the cliff. And then twice Jesus was sleeping in the boat, and Satan tried to sink the boat, as if you could kill the master of ocean, earth, and sky by sinking their boat. And then on the cross, finally Satan thought he won, but as we know, he didn't, and Revelation 12 says that. So the conflict of the ages is Satan opposing God's plan for Israel. What is God's plan for Israel? That they would be the covenant chosen people through whom the scriptures would come, through whom the Messiah would come, and through whom the Messiah would return as the King of Kings and Lords to rescue them at the end of days. The second coming of Christ is completely about rescuing Israel in the Bible. It's Jesus coming to rescue Israel from the Antichrist. And so chapter 12 ends with God's display. Look what it says in chapter 12, verse 13. When the dragon saw he had been cast to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle. She could fly into the wilderness. So God protects Israel during the second half of the tribulation, where she's nourished for a time, times, and half a time. There's another. Remember, 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. Time, times, 1 time, 2 times, and a half a time, so 3.5 years. But look at this, verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of Christ, who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And verse 11 tells us that they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, the word of his testimony, and they did not love their lives unto death. That's horrible persecution and God preserving people as Satan makes war on the saints. Well, that takes us to chapter 13. We have 7 minutes to go to chapter 13, which is one of the most fascinating chapters in the Bible, followed by chapter 14 next hour, which I think is the single most important chapter for anybody that's thinking about serving the Lord with their life. So let me buzz through chapter 13. Revelation 13 is about the beast of Revelation. Who is he? He is a man with 33 titles in the Bible. One of them is the man of sin. He's described by Daniel as superhuman, the final Caesar, Daniel says. He is the author of the 666 thing we're going to see in chapter 13. He is Jesus-like. People think he's finally Jesus. We don't think of this guy as an ogre. He is the man that wins the world. Everyone wants to worship him. He just seems so amazing. He becomes the global leader we've all looked for. He's the peacemaker, and God calls him the Antichrist. Not anti completely as against, but anti in place of. See, there are 2 meanings of anti. We think primarily of anti, but it could be anti, the word that means in place of. So I'm going to give you this in place of that. So in place of the real Jesus, I'll give you the fake Jesus, the anti, the creation of Satan. Point number 1, chapter 13. Look at verse 1. Again, look at this. John is an eyewitness. And I, John, standing on the sand of the sea, I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and his 10 horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear. I mean, this is awful stuff. It's like the worst part of all the beasts. What's it saying? Antichrist is a monster. He's Satan's Superman. He's described in depth in Daniel 7. He's super intelligent, Daniel tells us. He's a super communicator. He's the ultimate politician. He's a businessman and a general, and very proud. Very much like Satan. In fact, Jesus already introduced him in John 8:44. He looked at the religious leaders and he said, "You're of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he abode not in the truth. And when he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of lies." Satan is the original Antichrist. The Antichrist is only the embodiment in a human body of Satan. Now think about this. Demons are intelligent spirits. That's what the word daimon means. Satan is the most powerful and intelligent being ever created. The Bible clearly teaches that we can expect an invasion from the pit in the last days. John warns us about that in his little epistle before he wrote Revelation. And we already know what the Bible says. During the final days, most people, the majority, are going to be led astray. So what did Jesus say we should do? Well, if you read Matthew 24, the most repeated warning is, don't be deceived, don't be deceived, don't be deceived, don't be deceived. That's the same thing Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2. The greatest danger we face today is not knowing the truth of God's word. And your generation, not you in this room, but your generation, knows more about the latest words that the pop musicians are cooking up and you're watching and listening to with your endlessly connected earbuds, than you know about the truth of God. There's never been a generation more biblically illiterate since the 1700s. I mean, all English-speaking people were just inbred with the Bible. All of Christian literature, all of English literature is filled with Christian symbols and Christian, kind of like metaphors and everything else that were explained all the time. Our culture has effectively erased all those and detached this generation from knowing the truth. They're so keen on entertainment, they don't know the truth of God. Now, look what it says in Revelation 13, and you have to read this whole book, and I could read the whole book out loud and talk about every verse, but it takes a lot longer than the little time we have. But look at verse 11. Another beast coming out of the earth, he spoke like a dragon. He exercises the authority of the first beast, so this is a false prophet, in his presence, and causes all on earth, those who dwell, to worship the first beast. Now look at verse 13. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. The Antichrist is going to have this front man, the false prophet, who's empowered by Satan to do fake signs and wonders. How would you like to be watching on TV and see this religious leader named the false prophet go, you want to know if I'm really who I say I am? And he goes like that. And what you see with CGI on the Avengers, with Thor and thunder, actual lightning comes out of the sky, fire, and burns something up. And you go, how did they do that? He said, do you think that's CGI? Do you think that's a movie? Watch. And he does it again, and he does it again. And this guy has the entire ability to channel the power of Satan. Remember in Job, Satan could send lightning, tornadoes. He could send diseases. He could inspire people to do things. This man commands that under Satan's power. And then he is the one that rolls out this mark of the beast that we've all heard about. Now look, I just was reading, and look, this is from March 13th, 2023, from one of the science magazines. They say in 2045, we're going to have the technological singularity of what Elon Musk and a whole bunch of other people are trying to do. They're trying to implant chips so that we can combine electronics with the human body. And they're showing, a brain on this chip. But the real Terminator's coming in verses 14 and 15. Before I read it, think of what it is. Satan, who's already knows all about us, he's the ultimate intelligence and power. With our artificial intelligence we're developing, with some type of android, or a humanoid, and the false prophet makes an image of the beast, an idol, that speaks and kills anyone who won't take the mark of the beast.